Well, election season is upon us. Commercial after commercial features politicians who are doing their best to convince us that their opponents are unfit for office. The problem is that both sides are doing such a good job that we now agree neither candidate has any business holding positions of leadership. Of course, in such contests, it's appropriate to draw contrasts between choices before us. I mean, how else do we decide whom to vote for in the election? But it does seem that there is far less attention paid to the positives of the candidates. In other words, the things they might do to help us, the reasons to vote for them, than the many often exaggerated reasons to vote against them, putting them down. In today's gospel lesson from Luke, we hear not a politician, but a religious leader putting down others as flawed and thus inferior. He's a Pharisee. Now, a Pharisee is a member of one of the Jewish sects or groups, that's S-E-C-T-S, of first century Palestine. Pharisees were respected members of the community, educated leaders among the people. And this Pharisee in this parable that Jesus gave provided a couple of examples of his piety to show that, yes, indeed, he deserves the respect that would have been given to him. I mean, he listed the fact that he fasted twice a week and that he tithed 10% on all of his income. He was what most folks would be considered a positive role model, given his devotion to God and to the law. So if anyone in that faith community would be expected to be blessed by God, it would be him. You might say that as a precursor to today's election commercials, the Pharisee drew a contrast between himself and others, namely sinners, and he put them down. He made it clear that he was proud not to be associated with such scoundrels as thieves and rogues and adulterers, or even a tax collector who just happened to be in the temple at the time. What's noteworthy is that he was making it clear that he had disdain for such persons, and thus his sense of superiority was there over them. This is all in the middle of a prayer to God. He was thanking God that he was not like any of them. For those who have heard this parable many, many times, and that may be most of us, it's easy rather to get lulled into a simple interpretation. We've heard about those hypocritical Pharisees. That's what we always do, the hypocritical Pharisees throughout the Gospels. And so we tend to view them as the bad characters in the story. They become one-dimensional to us and only negative in our eyes. And if we're not careful, we might say a prayer similar to what we heard in the parable. Thank God I'm not one of those Pharisees. You see, from our modern perspective, we lose some of the sting of this story. The people listening to Jesus telling it, however, would have caught it because, as I just noted, they would have considered the Pharisee to be good and blessed by God. That's how they're hearing the story when Jesus is telling the parable. He's the good guy in the story. And they would have shared the Pharisee's disdain for the other character in the parable, the tax collector. Even though we tend to elevate him to sainthood as this wonderful, sweet, gentle, humble man. Tax collectors were despised by the general populace of Palestine. They were seen as traitors because they were working for the occupying Roman government, and they were considered thieves because they had lined their pockets with tax money above and beyond what they were required to collect for Rome. And so the tax collector would be assumed by the Jesus audience to be the bad guy in the story. It's really hard for us to feel that tension, but it's important for us to do so if we're going to feel the full impact of this parable. Jesus says that hated character, the tax collector, stood far off from everyone else and was so guilt-ridden that he wouldn't look up to heaven as he prayed. Now, in that day, the customary way to pray was with your hands open and looking up to God. Not like we do today where we naturally bow our heads. In fact, I read, interestingly enough, and I hadn't read this before, that it was this very parable that was an influence on Christians now doing what we most often do, which is to bow our heads. Now, by the way, you can pray any way you want to God. You don't have to bow. You can pray with your eyes open. In fact, if you're driving, I recommend it entirely. Jesus says that that person separated himself, and he was so ashamed of whatever sin was burdening him that day that he prayed only this: God, be merciful to me, a sinner. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. No comparisons to anyone, no list of merits, no expressions of gratitude for not being as bad as some other people, just a simple and sincere plea for God's mercy. The contrast between the Pharisee and the tax collector is striking. The tax collector doesn't ask anything of God. Instead, he mainly thanks God, or it feels more like congratulates God for making him such a fine human being, an exemplar for the community, and not like all that riffraff out there. On the other hand, as I said, the tax collector doesn't offer up any of his own accomplishments or fine qualities. In fact, the only self-disclosure in his prayer is that he is a sinner. He does ask God for something, though. The one key thing all of us should look to God for, and that's mercy. Now, here's an important point, therefore. Both men are sinners. Both men are sinners. The sin of the Pharisee, who otherwise evidently was obeying the law, was pride and perhaps arrogance, too. And in his outward focus on others whom he looked down on and even regarded with contempt. Notice the first line in this passage today that Luke talks about. He regarded others with contempt. He failed to see within himself his own shortcomings and therefore his need for God's forgiving grace. He was blinded to his own sin by his contempt for other persons. The tax collector was also a sinner. The difference between him and the Pharisee was that he, the tax collector, knew it. And rather than ignore his brokenness, he brought it to God and he sought forgiveness. He understood his total dependence on God for his salvation, for justification. So the Pharisee asks for nothing, and he gets nothing in return. He believes he has all he needs by his own efforts, and he exalts himself for his accomplishments, which is why he doesn't seek justification or salvation from God. He is self-righteous, believing in his own righteousness. But actually, you could say he is self-unrighteous because he's not justified or made righteous when praying to God. The tax collector, on the other hand, in spite of his wealth obtained by taking advantage of people, knows he has nothing that he can bring that can bring him salvation. So he pleads with God for mercy. He realizes his self-unrighteousness and thus his total dependence on God. He may have been the bad guy, but in the end, he's made right with God. His broken relationship with the Lord is healed, and he is made whole. He is made whole. So where do we fit in with all of this? Rebecca Messman, a pastor in Northern Virginia, makes a number of observations about this passage of Scripture that really resonate with me. For example, she points out that every one of us is the Pharisee, and every one of us is the tax collector. As to the former, she notes that we all have the Pharisee living inside us when we define ourselves by what we are not to God. And so like the Pharisee, we list in our heads all kinds of poor behaviors, and you can choose from any number of those frowned upon activities, and we take comfort in the fact that we don't engage in them. We may earnestly pray for those who do, but our tendency to define ourselves as what we are not means that we are often wearing the mask of hypocrisy, something Jesus accused the Pharisees of now and then. I have to confess something. I did that very thing yesterday morning. I came here to the church. We had 2 memorial services yesterday here at the church, and I was here in the morning, and I noticed right after I parked my car that somebody had dropped chewing gum on the pavement right behind my car. Well, I worried about stepping in it on the way back. I did actually, a few weeks ago, stepped in somebody's chewing gum, or I worried that somebody else would step in it later in the day. And so I got a stick and I scraped it up off the pavement, and that was real fun, and I carried it into the church. And all the time as I'm walking, I'm thinking to myself how those who are so careless in dropping chewed gum, not just chewing gum, but chewed gum, where others can step on it, are rude and selfish. And then I continued working on this sermon about hypocrisy, and I was rather convicted. I may not toss gum on the pavement, but there are plenty of other selfish things I do. I had discovered my inner Pharisee. Rebecca Messman tells of how hers appears when she goes to the doctor. She says she tries to be strong and manage well. And man, oh man, I'm convicted again, because I'm always going in there thinking I'm going to fail the test or something like that. And so I get nervous about it. And I can relate, because I don't want to fail in my self-care. Hear what I just said? Whose care? Self-care. Messman said she noticed one time handwritten on her medical chart A+, and she got really proud about that until she realized it was her blood type. She noted that impressing one's doctor and downplaying one's health deficits can get in the way of the physicians giving us the best care possible. Sounds like the Pharisee in Jesus' parable in relation to God, doesn't it? That's when Messman says we embrace the tax collector within us, that part of us hidden in the shadows, far off from our family and our friends who expect us to be fine all the time. This is actually a positive move, when what is revealed, she says, is that part of us broken by relationships, broken by temptations, broken by self-loathing, broken by our past, broken by our fear of the future, broken by the choices we made and the ones we didn't make. Messman says the shadow side of our soul finally steps into the light and hears Jesus say, "You have been justified, not for what you aren't, but for what you are." So to wrap this up, I'm going to quote Messman once more. She says, what Jesus wants is ourselves. The worst part of our lives finally aired out, no longer weighing us down with perfectionism, but thrown off at the foot of the cross. Jesus is seeking tax collectors who dwell within every person, ready to be made whole again by his amazing grace, ready to receive his radical love that gives us what we do not deserve in the radical commonwealth of Christ's love, where the last shall be first, the sick will be healed, the blind shall see, and the poor